r/nosleep. Posted by YungSeti. I need help. My husband is being a complete gentleman, and I think I'm in grave danger. The title says it all. Before I explain, just know that I understand you're going to judge me and I'm really not here for it. I know I'm an asshole. I know what I did was wrong, believe me, so I'm not posting here to be chastised by a bunch of holier-than-thou internet folks who've never done anything wrong in their lives. No, I'm here because I'm freaking the fuck out, and I need advice ASAP in what may genuinely be a situation of life or death. First off, I loved my husband. Truly, I did. I can practically hear you all scoffing as you read this, but regardless of what you think about what I did, it is how I feel. My infidelity had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with my own selfishness. I missed that excitement I felt in the early days of our relationship. I want to preface this by saying Aaron, that's what we'll call him, had always been an absolute sweetheart, and even after my colossal fuck up, I was still convinced that he was my soulmate. That is what makes the present dilemma as difficult as it is, why my mind has been twisting itself into knots like a snake, trying to determine what I need to do. I know in my heart of hearts, that Aaron would never hurt me, could never hurt me. He's always handled me with so delicate a hand, you'd think I was breakable, and I could barely recall even an argument in which his voice had raised, and yet, I can't shake the fear that the love of my life might be planning to kill me. Things had grown distant between Aaron and I in the previous few months. His work at a cybersecurity firm had been swallowing up much of his time, and what little I did get with him was often relegated to eating or sleeping, despite his best attempts. One thing led to another, and I let myself get a bit too close with Brandon, an old friend from college, who I'd been casually corresponding with on Facebook for a while. He'd been making his advances less and less subtle. What started as mild flirty texts, scratching that itch for excitement I'd felt like I'd lost with Aaron, quickly became less fulfilling, until it escalated into pictures, those pictures intensifying into videos and promises, which soon led to action. It seemed like before I could really get a handle on what exactly I was doing, I was engaged in a full-fledged affair right under Aaron's nose. I meant to end things, truly, I did. I spent the night after my first secret meeting with Brandon just racked with guilt. Every kiss on the forehead or kind word from Aaron made thorny vines of regret squeeze tighter around my heart. I wish I could say that was the end of it. Dear God, I know I'm an awful person, I know I should have taken it as a sign to stop. However, if anything, I did the opposite. Instead, I dulled the pain of my own betrayal, with the momentary pleasure that those secret moments offered, the wrongness of it all only adding to the intrigue. It wasn't until a month later, this week to be exact, that it all came to an abrupt end. As much as I regret to admit it, through no choice of my own. Now, I'm here, writing this on my phone with shaking hands while my husband cooks us dinner downstairs, singing cheerily to himself. The heavy aroma of meat being cooked wafts up the stairs, sweet and savory, and I've never been more terrified of what might become of me. I can't wait to see you again tomorrow. To hold you again, it's all I've been able to think of. I bit my lip, stifling the smile I felt rising in me as I read the text. I swallowed hard, my face running hot, coughing and rubbing my palms over it to hide the blush I knew must be visible. You seem happy tonight. What's up? I met Aaron's gaze from across the table, breaking it just as quickly as guilt blossomed in place of that secretive excitement. He grinned up at me, spinning a forkful of the pasta he'd brought home for dinner. I stifled a frown, a twinge of sad sort of pain in my heart at his expression. He was as adorable as ever, big brown eyes looking back at me with that childish sort of adoration he'd always had with me. His carefree grin, despite the lines of age and exhaustion from work, had slowly begun etching in his features. Nothing. My mind scrambled for an adequate response, something that would pacify him enough to prevent any more questions. I'm happy you're home. Always am. I smiled, reaching across the table and placing one of my hands atop his for good measure. His eyes lit up, grin growing into a full-blown smile as he raised it to plant a kiss. How can you do this to him? The thought rang so loud in my mind I was almost sure he could hear it. You're a terrible person. He doesn't deserve. The gentle buzz of my phone sent pins and needles rippling atop my skin like a tidal wave. My heart tingled with a nervous, yet intoxicating sort of excitement. I found myself searching for an excuse to step away from the table, my stomach churning with a regrettable longing. Aaron's smirk wavered but was back in place as soon as it had fallen. Still, in that brief instant, I wondered if I hadn't seen a momentary glimpse of something else. I felt a brief sense of trepidation at the thought, but it was dashed by another jolt of my nerves as the phone buzzed yet again. Gotta run to the bathroom, I said, as I pulled away from the table. He nodded briefly, chuckling. Have fun, love. I'll pour you another glass. His eyes followed me as I made my way to the hall. Jess, the sound of my name halted me in my tracks, heart beating with anticipation, hand almost tingling to grab for my phone. I know things haven't been perfect lately, what with the new job and everything, and maybe I've been slacking a bit. I can tell you've been feeling that. His voice wavered, the emotion he seemed to be trying to restrain momentarily bubbling to the surface. I felt my own spinning into a quiet maelstrom just beneath the surface. He was right, of course. Hell, he was only stating a realization I'd had months prior. I suppose I ought to offer some background on how we got here. Aaron and I have been together for 7 years and married for 3 wonderful years out of those. We met our sophomore year of college in a physics class we both shared, and to hear him tell it, he was smitten from the moment we were assigned to work on that project together. It took me a vital bit longer to see the connection, but the two of us grew close over the course of that year, and eventually, I fell head over heels. From the earliest days of our relationship, it was obvious he was the rare sort of college guy who actually listened when I spoke, often surprising me with little gifts or dates that correspond with things or interests I'd shared with him. He was attentive and gentle, the sort of person who moved the spider outside rather than squashing it, and he was the first guy I dealt with who seemed not to complain that I was too self-absorbed or didn't seem to care about him as a person or any of that nonsense. I say all this to reiterate just how much I knew then, and have known all this time. I found a gem. But, like all relationships, with time, things began to shift. He had begun work at a new tech startup, working long hours in cybersecurity that kept him away from home and left him drained during the hours he was present. He kept up with his share of the duties around the house, even maintaining much of the cooking for us, but it was different. Things began to die down at an alarming rate, and before long I felt like our love life had already aged decades. I suppose that's where my selfishness played a role. I guess I had become accustomed to a certain level of romantic attention, and as the months rolled by, with far less attention being paid to me by Aaron, I began to feel dissatisfied in my relationship. This is when I made the mistake made by so many others, and sought out the nearest replacement, letting myself get a bit too close with Brandon, an old friend from college. We'd been casually corresponding on Facebook for a while, and he had been making his advances less and less subtle until eventually, I reciprocated. What started as mild flirty texts, scratching that itch for excitement I'd felt like I'd lost with Aaron, quickly became less fulfilling, until it escalated into pictures, those pictures intensifying into videos and promises, which soon led to action. It seemed like before I could really get a handle on what exactly I was doing, I was engaged in a full-fledged affair right under Aaron's nose. It didn't change how I felt about him, truly, and at the moment, my insides burned with regret. His eyes met mine, and it took everything I had not to look away. But I love you. And I'm gonna make sure to remind you of it more. I could only manage a nod before turning and hurrying to the bathroom, as the myriad of conflicting emotions battled towards the surface. I'd like to say I blocked Brandon the moment I entered the bathroom and broke down in silent sobbing. Instead, I responded in kind. Miss you too. Can't wait for tomorrow. I wish it was a lie, but the truth is I was feeling so guilty about my affair that it ironically was the only thing in life that still felt good. I sat on the lid of the toilet for a while, wondering just how I'd let things get so far, before running the water. I splashed a handful on my face, and as I stood before the mirror, I found my eyes staring anywhere but. I didn't recognize the person looking back. The rest of the night passed by relatively normal. By the time I left the restroom, Aaron was cleaning up, and straightening the table. Despite the almost incredulous look he gave me, he said nothing. He threw something on the television, which I was utterly unable to focus on, my mind already on the day ahead. Had I been more attentive, perhaps I'd have noticed just how closely he was watching me. The way he was almost searching me for something like I was under examination. I would find out the very next day. By the time I woke up, the alarm on my phone blared through the wisps of sleep as an unusual grogginess clung to me. I silently cursed each glass of wine I'd had the night prior. As I attempted to regain my faculties through a headache far too severe for 3 glasses of Merlot, sunlight was streaming through the bedroom window, and I could hear Aaron moving about the room. It was 10, or little after. It would be a late start at work for Aaron today. He had told me that things at work would be easing up soon and that due to their hard work in the months prior, they were allowed to come in a few hours later. I couldn't help but resent that it couldn't have come months before. I heard him as he approached the side of the bed, my eyes still shut. I felt a kiss on my forehead. After today, things will be different. His voice was low, and while I knew his words ought to be comforting, they made guilt swirl about my gut. I could smell the familiar cologne wafting off of him. I promise you and Wei will go do something. I'll take some time off and we can go somewhere, anywhere you want. He told me, leaning over as I lay in bed, planting a parting kiss on my forehead. I hardly opened my eyes, only nodding my response with feigned grogginess, feeling far too guilty to respond knowing what I was planning to do that very day. Through the slits that were my eyelids, I could see him watching me. He stood at the end of the bed for what felt like an unusual amount of time, his eyes on me, expression something unreadable. For reasons I couldn't understand, it made my skin crawl, and my heart rate quicken. Does he know something? I stayed frozen, suddenly feeling like a child who was unsure if they were on the verge of being in trouble, unwilling to open or close my eyes even a bit until he had left. After a few more seconds, he chuckled to himself, and shook his head, before turning and heading for the door. I didn't open my eyes fully until I heard the garage door closing and his car pulling out of the driveway, my heart thudding so hard in my chest that I was sure it would have given me away. When I did finally get up, it took a few minutes for me to gather myself, a whole new wave of anxiety gnawing at me, before I started to ready myself for the day ahead. I reached blindly across my nightstand, letting my eyes shut again as I sighed with a mix of relief to be alone, and the ever-present anxiety at my overarching situation, feeling for my phone, expecting my hand to brush across it at any second. As I felt my hand slide across the empty wood, there was a surge of realization like being submerged in ice water, a jolt rolling through my entire body. I shot up, immediately searching the table, hearing my heart thudding in my head. It sat neatly on the far corner of the table, still plugged in. I felt a cold dread beginning to knit itself into my very being. It was all too neat. I couldn't remember for the life of me how I'd left it sitting the night before, but I was sure of one thing: it had been facing down. I stared at it for several seconds, as though it might change the reality. My distorted reflection stared back from the screen of my phone. Fuck, I breathed. Fuck. Every second that passed as I hurried to open the phone felt like I was moving closer to a heart attack. Nausea bubbled up like boiling water in my chest as it clicked open. I swiped up, displaying all of my open apps, scrolling immediately to the messages, and not stopping until I was on the thread named Melissa. I felt a surge of relief as I scrolled through. Nothing had been sent from my side. I was certain if Aaron suspected anything, he'd have at least questioned Brandon. It seemed, for now, my betrayal was still hidden. The only new text from Melissa had been sent the night before. Looking forward to work tomorrow. Been wanting to get that project of ours done since last week. I breathed a sigh of relief. All of the most incriminating messages had been deleted immediately after sending. I couldn't help but smile. All of the previous anxiety faded as I set to getting ready for the day. By the end of the hour, I was in my car, heading out of town towards our planned meeting spot. We'd agreed on a motel far enough away from both of our cities. One that we hoped would ensure even the brief possibility of running into anyone either of us knew. We planned to spend the day together, allowing me to return long before Aaron or his wife returned from work, hopefully raising no suspicion. The ride there was one of peaks and valleys, almost overwhelming excitement making me jittery. Believe me, there was doubt. Hell, there were several moments stuck at red lights, in which I nearly felt myself turning the car around. God, I should have, I didn't. It probably wouldn't have made a difference at that point. I pulled in front of the motel around 11:40 a.m. The parking lot was a small square of concrete tucked at the center of the L-shaped building. Mine was one of the only vehicles in the 12 or so spaces, with the exception of an old Ford pickup well past its best days, and a sedan. Neither of which was Brandon's car, the picture of which I'd almost religiously committed to memory in the days before. I debated between waiting in the car or checking in, my nerves eventually making me settle on the former, though the longer I waited the more I felt my eyes searching nervously. After sending a few texts, none of which received responses, I felt my nerves reaching a boiling point. I knew I was far enough away that no one I knew should see me, but the thought alone made my stomach flip. After several minutes of internal debate, I quickly gathered myself and hurried into the building. The lobby was empty, a small room with puke green walls illuminated by garish fluorescent lighting. A single man sat behind the desk, short, and slightly balding, not even bothering to glance in my direction as he watched whatever show was blaring from the screen of his phone. After an awkward few moments, I cleared my throat, prompting an uninterested stare. We have a reservation under Billy Tucker, I spoke, trying to sound confident as I offered the fake name Brandon had given. The man cleared his throat, a loud, obnoxious sound, sucking his teeth as he glanced over at the wall full of keys to the side of him. After a moment, he responded. That room's already been checked in. I frowned, feeling a stir of confusion that only worsened my anxiety. Who? When? I'd seen no sight of Brandon's car. Had he taken an Uber? It felt strange that I wouldn't have seen him. The man flipped his phone, seemingly moving on to texting as a method of trying to ignore me. Perhaps, he just wanted to get here early to surprise me. I smiled a bit at that. Given the romantic nature of his messages, I certainly wouldn't put it past him to try and doll the room up a bit, doing his part to make the most out of the dreary motel room. Still, it was a bit past 10:30 a.m. He should have been there almost a half hour ago, and if there was one thing I'd come to learn about Brandon, it was his punctuality. When did? He came a few hours ago, maybe 6, maybe 7. Checked into the room, and left a few hours later. He cut me off, finishing whatever message he was sending as he slipped his phone away. He looked me up and down, snorting loudly for a moment as if to clear his throat. Seemed real eager for your arrival, Missy. He stared behind me, giving little attempt at tact before grunting with and adding. Can't imagine why. My eyes squinted, face twisting into an expression that, if looks could kill, would surely have struck him dead. My mind spun for a moment as I considered the variables. For one, it made little sense that Brandon would arrive so early. For another, he had my number, why not respond to the string of texts I'd sent since I'd arrived? I swallowed hard. All of my excitement for the day was quickly fading, leaving only a burning sense of anxiety. I felt like a child again, with the lingering sense that I may just be in trouble. Had his wife caught him? The thought was like a bucket of ice water over any passion still smoldering in me. If she did she know who I was? Would she tell Aaron? The questions tumbled one after the other through my mind, each raising my heart rate more than the last. Was he alone? I asked suddenly, hardly even realizing the words were on my lips. Was there anyone with him? Did someone meet him here or, I don't know, find him? The man pursed his lips, staring to the ceiling in a look of exaggerated concentration. You know, come to think of it, there might have just been someone with him. Hard to remember sitting here for so long. I felt my heart take a plunge. Who? Was it a woman? Was she angry? I held my tongue before I could begin rambling. Jesus, it was so long ago. This is a busy establishment and I'm not sure I can remember without a little help, maybe some motivation. My teeth felt ready to crumble with how hard I grit them, as I reached for my wallet with all the speed and fervor of molasses. I pulled out a 20, and at the sound of sucked teeth, pulled out another. He reached for the cash before I could even offer it, snatching it with his thick fingers, and smiled. Yup, I remember now. There was a guy. Dark hair, maybe late 20s, early 30s. He pulled in a little bit after your Tucker fellow. Gave the name and the room number, so I gave him a key. Gave me a 50 just to text him when you got here. I felt my heart pounding, a series of conflicting emotions and rising questions fighting for supremacy in my mind. He paid you too, you gave him the key? Who was it? Did you get a name? He appeared indignant at the clearly accusatory tone of my question. No, I didn't. I don't get into the business of what you people do in my rooms, and I'm definitely not asking no two men about what they're getting into. Who the fuck do you take me for? He stood and walked over to the wall, grabbing a key. Here. You've got the room until 8, you can take it and fuck off or just fuck off. He huffed, turning his chair to the side as he returned to whatever he'd been watching on the phone before. I stood for a moment, staring between the man and the keys on the table, before deciding I'd get no further with him, and snatched them up while I muttered. Asshole. As I stepped out of the lobby and back outside, the shift from anger to mild, uneasy panic was immediate. I felt my breath grow uneven as I began making my way towards the room. A quick scan of the parking lot still showed no signs of him. My head spun. The most likely conclusion I could think of, or most prominent at least, was that he'd been found out by his wife. It couldn't explain what the man at the front desk had told me if he was being honest, and for $40 I hoped he was. Brandon had been here and been followed into the room by a man who knew the name and number to ask for. I racked my mind for who would be following him like that. Had his wife hired a PI? A relative, perhaps? None of it felt right. I couldn't see any reason for someone to follow him into the room. I arrived outside of the door, my mind still turning over the sparse details offered. I pushed it open, partly hoping to be greeted with his voice, but it was empty. Well, not empty. I quickly made my way to the bedside, my eyes locked immediately on the note sitting on the side of the bed. I picked it up immediately, my eyes running along the sides laced with decorative depictions of flowers. Dear Jesse, if you've listened to my instructions, you're reading this on the way home. Hours after we've already met. I'm not much for love notes, as you can probably tell. But I sometimes find expressing things face to face even harder, so I wrote this beforehand to make sure you've heard/read it at some point tonight. The time we've spent talking has been the happiest I've felt in years. You remind me that there's more to all of this than the daily slog. I'm glad to share this moment with you, and here's to the hope that perhaps, one day, it won't have to be so covert. P.S. Hope you like the roses. I felt my heart pounding as I finished the letter, searching immediately for the roses, and finding none. Had he not had the time to leave them? So he had been here, long enough to leave me a note clearly, someone had followed him in, and now he was gone. My heart pounded, my head buzzing with rising panic as dark thoughts began to creep in. I pulled out my phone, finally calling. It rang and rang, with no answer. I tried again, and again, and again, 5 calls more, all yielding the same result. For a moment I flirted with the thought of calling the police, but as logic followed the panic, a series of flaws showed themselves with that idea. What would I tell them? Officer, the man I'm cheating with failed to show up to our shady meeting. I believe he might be. I didn't even want to finish the thought. It was ridiculous, of course. The more rational, albeit still painful probability was that guilt had overtaken him, and he'd turned back. The thought hurt on several levels, chiefly the guilt I felt having had the decision made for me. Still, none of it explained what the man at the front desk had said. There had been another man to ask for a key, and who'd paid him $50 to know when I'd arrived. Someone had followed him in here. With that emerged the darker possibility, that even if something had happened to him, I couldn't openly report it. Getting tied into an investigation would inevitably expose what we were involved in. I felt my stomach flip, the urge to vomit making my eyes water. No. He's fine. He's fine, and he simply went home. I tried my best to be louder than the dark thoughts, but it didn't account for the stranger details of the day. After a few more moments of trying to grasp the situation, I decided it best to return home early. I could think of an adequate excuse for Aaron as to why I'd be leaving work so soon. I didn't want to spend a moment longer in that silent motel room, accompanied only by my thoughts growing more unnerving by the second. As I made my way back to the car, I felt an unwavering sense of disappointment tinged with my anxiety. I'd been looking forward to our meeting for so long, looking forward to finally feeling his arms around me, but now would be returning home with little more than worry and that note to accompany me. If it did turn out he just had second thoughts, it would hurt, but at that point, I just wanted an answer. My head spun as my car roared to life, and I cast a final glance at the motel in the vain hopes he may pull into the parking lot. There was nothing, of course. I sighed. Another man with him. I picked over what the guy had told me, sifting through what few details were offered. Dark-haired, maybe 20s or 30s. I felt a twinge of something cold and distant deep within. The icy claw of suspicion, faint but present. Quickly, I pulled my key from the ignition, speed walking across the lot and bursting into the lobby, quite a bit more frenzied than I'd intended. I could hear the faint thud of my heart as it began to speed up, the eerie suspicion echoing amidst my darker thoughts. The chubby man at the front desk shot me an irritated look as I approached, likely expecting some complaint about the room. The man, I breathed, hardly even spacing out my words as they spilled forth. The man who came with Bran, Billy. Did he have glasses? My stomach tightened as soon as the question left my lips, the deeper implications of the question setting my nerves alight. The man at the front desk smiled, though there was no humor in the expression, his face quickly returning to that exaggerated, quizzical look. I groaned but quickly pulled out my wallet, offering another 20 without complaint. As a matter of fact he did, he said with a phony smile, real smart looking fella, he was. Though, he didn't seem to be in the best of moods. I felt my breath catch. The room seemed to be spinning. His eyes searched me, a nasty smile growing. Something tells me that means something to you, huh? Well, I've got nothing else for you. You're welcome to stand here and keep paying me, but if not, he gestured to the door. I nodded slowly, feeling shell-shocked as realization began to sink its icy claws into me. I realized the thought had always been there, from the moment he'd failed to arrive, growing more prominent with each strange coincidence. The key is in the room. I breathed, turning slowly and walking towards the door, never blinking once even though my mind was spinning. When I got to the car, I sat for several minutes, my hands clasping the steering wheel as I stared out the window ahead. After several moments, I took out my phone and sent another text, though I knew I was unlikely to get a response. I just want to know that you're okay. I'm not mad, just worried. Please text me back. I sighed, staring helplessly at the screen. Somewhere, In the dark reaches of my mind, the cold tendrils of an uncomfortable idea began to grip me. I opened Google, and typed in a question, hoping beyond hope that I'd find no answer. How to recover deleted messages, iPhone. With every second that the screen loaded, I felt nausea grow stronger. I'd never been the most tech savvy. It was one of the many things I appreciated about Aaron, as he always served as my in-house tech support over the years. I'd tried to the best of my ability to cover my tracks, but he had always known much more about the stuff than me. Finally, it finished, a series of links appeared before me, and my heart dropped. Following the first of them, I returned quickly to my messages, hands hardly working fast enough. I clicked edit, almost dropping my phone as I saw the deleted messages tab. Fuck. My mind was immediately taken back to that morning, my phone placed so carefully on the desk. I suddenly felt quite certain I hadn't left it facing up. Stupid. 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 It was all I could think of as I tapped on the conversation between Brandon and I. Somehow, I already suspected what I might see, though I couldn't yet understand its darkest implications. All of our texts loaded, every single one, all of the flirtatious messages and explicit photos I'd hoped to have cast into a digital abyss, laid out bare. As I scrolled, my mouth went dry, the breath catching in my throat as I read the last several messages sent from my phone. I realized, with dawning dread, that I recognized none of them. They hadn't been sent by me. I checked the times, the first one was sent at 1:23 a.m. Long after I'd fallen asleep. Hey, Aaron's leaving earlier tomorrow. Let's meet around 4. We want as much time as possible after all. My stomach twisted into a tight ball, vision wavering and head spinning as I read the text I never sent, the feeling only worsening with Brandon's response. Even better. Trish is leaving for her mother's house around 6, I can think of an excuse to head out a bit early. An emergency at the hospital, probably. He followed it up with an image that would have made me blush any other time, but only made that ball in my stomach tighten. I can't wait to be inside of you, for you to feel my love, I'll see you soon. He said to follow it up. I rankled at that, at the thought of Aaron reading that. You will. My head pounded as I continued the rest of the conversation. It had taken place between the time of the first message and 5 a.m. Brandon had texted me to let me know he was en route, and my phone had responded back saying the same. Around 6, both sides confirmed arrival, Brandon telling me he'd be waiting in the room and that he had something for me. I can't wait. I'll be there in a second. And eyes closed, I have a surprise for you, too. It was the last message sent from my phone that I hadn't sent. There was no follow-up from Brandon, the only texts remaining in the thread all coming from me from the start of that morning. I let my phone fall to the side, clattering into the console, as my head fell onto the steering wheel. I screamed. I screamed until I could taste the coppery flavor of blood at the back of my throat, not stopping until someone pulled into the lot, and cast me an odd look. I grappled with what to do next, what I should do. There was only one logical conclusion. Desperately I wanted to avoid it, and that was that Aaron had gotten into my phone when I was asleep and sent those texts. Given his proficiency with technology, I didn't doubt he'd known about recovering deleted messages long beforehand and had seen what I had tried to hide. What that meant for Brandon, I wasn't sure. The logical, hopeful part of me told me Aaron must have confronted Brandon, maybe even threatened to expose him to his wife and made him back off. It would explain the radio silence. The less hopeful part, which I couldn't help but feel eerily drawn to, told me Aaron had confronted Brandon. But the outcome was that something far more sinister had happened. I wanted to vomit, I wanted to peel out of the parking lot and tear down the nearest highway to just disappear. As the bleak reality settled in, I knew I had nowhere else to go, and even if I did, I couldn't just disappear like that. Not without knowing what had happened. My mind became restless with unnerving thoughts, as I started my car and pulled out of the lot, beginning the drive home. It somehow felt twice as long as before. No amount of music at any volume was drowning out the questions I was asking myself, nor the curses I was directing at my own stupid and irrational behavior. By the time I pulled up in front of the house, my stomach was twisted into several knots. The lights were on inside, and as the garage door roared open, I saw that Aaron's car sat waiting inside. A part of me nearly peeled out of the driveway, not even sure of where I would go, but I kept it at bay. My stomach flipped as I turned my keys in the door, and as I opened it I was ready to see Aaron standing in wait. As the door opened, I was greeted only by the fragrant scent of spices and cooking meat wafting out from the kitchen. The sounds of movement, clattering pots, and closing cabinets confirmed what the smell already told me. Aaron was cooking, and taking particular care with this meal, if the watering of my mouth told me anything. Confusion served to abate some of the initial unease for a moment. I closed the door as silently as I could, though I was sure he'd heard me, and crept slowly through the living room, towards the entry to the kitchen. As I peered around the corner, I could hear Aaron humming to himself as he worked, watching as he busied himself with the meat he was sautéing. "Dinner will be ready in 10, I jumped as he spoke, almost forgetting that he'd heard me enter. "Go ahead and wait at the table," he said, turning to face me. His expression was utterly unreadable, the mask of professionalism I often saw from him on business calls, almost work-like, and yet, his eyes, despite his best attempt, I could see a cold rage beneath them. I felt my heart racing as it hammered against my chest, my mouth falling open to respond, yet I couldn't think of what to say. The air felt heavy, thick with a surreal sort of tension, as I was walking through a nightmare that felt like static between us. All of the day's confusion and anxiety whirled about my head in a simultaneous maelstrom. Fear, embarrassment, worry, confusion, and a mild dread all battling for dominance. After a long, dreadful moment of silence, I nodded, slowly making my way into the adjoining dining room. My heart dropped as I peered into the room and saw what sat on the table. At the very center, lay a bouquet of roses, wrapped in decorative paper covered in hearts. I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat and tried not to acknowledge the uncomfortable questions it raised. I took my seat at the far end of the table, hyper-aware of every noise from the sliding of the chair against the wood, and its creak as I sat, my nerves on high alert. I watched as he began plating the food, still humming some unfamiliar tune to himself, the knot in my gut only tightening. I couldn't understand why he was behaving the way he was, why he hadn't just confronted me already when I knew that he knew. Waiting for the other shoe to drop was torturous, and I felt as though I might be sick. He filled 2 glasses with water from the pitcher, walking the plates over to the table first. He placed his down at the opposite end of the table, before approaching me. I felt my heart thump, threatening to burst free of my chest as he reached over my shoulder, placing it in front of me. He repeated the same with the water, and without another word, took his place at the end of the table, and began eating. I watched, eyes wide and unblinking, stomach far too twisted to even think of taking a bite yet, though what looked to be the steak did smell enticing. After several bites, he looked up at me almost quizzically. "Eat. Please." I opened my mouth as if to argue, but given the situation, it felt like the last thing I had any right to do. Reluctantly, despite the nausea still nipping at my gut, I cut into the meat and took a bite. He nodded, as I chewed slowly. The taste was unfamiliar but deeply savory. I wondered what sort of seasoning he might have used. "How are the green beans?" he asked over a mouthful. I think I may have overseasoned them, but who knows? I stared back, still in disbelief, as I chewed the gamey meat. It was delicious but unfamiliar. I took another bite. "Was it elk? Deer? Why are you doing this?" I blurted the question before I could think better of it. He shot me a look, confused, though I could see in it the anger barely restrained. "Doing what, my love?" he asked, a mocking lilt in his question. "Cooking for my ungrateful, conniving, treacherous wife as I do so often? Well, why wouldn't I?" The sensation that pierced my chest was like a white-hot blade, my stomach lurching as he spoke. I knew he was angry, furious surely, but I'd never heard Aaron so much as address an unkind word at me. To hear such fury, almost hate, it chilled me to my core. Aaron, I know I fucked up. Shut up, shut the fuck up," he spat the words through clenched teeth, hands balling into fists around his utensils as he glared at me from across the table with such malice. For a moment I began to wonder just who I was sitting across. He glared at me for several seconds, as though he were considering something unspeakable before he took a breath, his face returning to the neutral mask of before. It was like he was dealing with a client, or talking to a boss rather than his wife. I apologized for the outburst. "Please, let's enjoy the rest of the meal." Tried to blink back the tears that were blurring my vision, feeling my face start to redden. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He nodded. "I'm sure you are. You're sorry that you forgot. For all the praise I heaped on you, I've always been the smarter one." His eyes locked with mine, and I was no longer looking at the Aaron who'd loved me for the past several years, but a cold, calculated man who had been scorned. "You're sorry you got caught. Maybe you're even sorry that you did it, but not because you regret it. Because you know there was no reality in which I wouldn't have caught you." I could only listen as he spoke, feeling equal parts hurt and regretful that a part of me agreed with him. He smiled, the expression somehow genuine, taking another bite of the meat. "But, it's okay. I think I can try and forgive you. After all, it's not a mistake I think you'll make again." He peered up at me. "Right?" The question was asked in such a tone that I knew there was one answer. And no, of course not. I wanted to be relieved, and part of me was, but something was still so wrong. My eyes fell on the roses lying on the table between us, my mind recalling the note I'd found on the motel bed. I had to know what had happened to Brandon. I'm so sorry to ask, believe me, it's not because, I just need to know. You were at that motel, the man in the lobby told me, you paid him to tell him when I arrived. You went into the room. My voice shook, but I met his gaze. What happened to Brandon? He laughed, a deep genuine sound. He laughed, and laughed, and laughed some more until his face was red and he'd sent himself into a near coughing fit. I felt my guts twisting themselves all the while. Mister, I want to be inside you? He asked, in a mock seductive voice. He chuckled. Don't worry, I made sure your lover got his wish. My head spun as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. As realization began to rise, like some beast surfacing from the dark waters, I felt my mouth begin to water, my throat heaving with the need to vomit. Speaking of which, how's the steak? First time cooking something that isn't beef, pork, or chicken, but he shrugged, eyes gleaming with malintent. I think I did all right. Posted by YungSeti. The house my father built was on a cursed foundation. A phantom roamed its halls. I knew something was wrong when my father awoke me that night. You have to stay quiet, princess, it's like a game. He would whisper. We can't wake up your mom. I'm taking you home now. I was confused but young, and still covered in the haze of sleep as he led me out of the house, to his truck in the driveway. Even my attempt to place the small bag I'd been allowed to pack in the trunk of his car was denied. Just hold it, Bryn, he said, pulling me back from the trunk. We need to be quick. I cast a look back at our house as we pulled off. A modest, two-story home in the suburbs, my room, was the second window on the top. It would be the last time I saw that house for years. I remember his face, illuminated in the passing street lamps as we drove. The expression he wore was unlike any I'd ever seen on his face before. In my youth, I attributed it to sadness. He and Mommy had been fighting a bunch recently, and I had heard the word divorce shouted. Which meant something, even to a 9-year-old. Now, I know it was a sort of guilt I hope to never understand. We drove for hours before the fog of sleep and confusion faded enough for me to ask. Is Mommy meeting us there? My father's grip tightened on the wheel. Your mother is, she's not a good person, Bryn. She wanted to take you away from me. I was confused. I knew my parents yelled and sometimes fought, but in my young mind Dad had never hurt me. Why would my mother ever want to do that? Wasn't my father doing that now? He told me we were going to a new house. That it wasn't ready yet, but he was building it and he would make sure it was the best house I'd ever seen. I would be able to design it with him, put a pool in the bathroom, a slide in place of stairs. By the time we arrived at the location, and his car was pulling to a halt, I had long since fallen asleep, my mind full of whimsical ideas about my new home. I arrived to a grim reality. The car was parked in the wake of the skeletal frame of a small house. It was by no means a palace. In fact, it was quite a bit smaller than the one we already had and sat in a lot surrounded by forest that made it difficult to discern direction. It was only partially completed, missing several walls and flooring in parts of the second floor. Just a little ways away from it at the mouth of the driveway sat an older model camping trailer, which would serve as our home for the following year. During that year, I learned not to ask about my mother, not to question why I couldn't call her, or when I'd next see her. Father's mood had always been prone to sudden shifts, almost exclusively towards anger. It had been the reason for so many of the fights he and my mother had. The ones where I would try my hardest to hum some song from memory or bury myself in a book, in the hopes of distracting myself from hearing the screaming and slamming. Even though Mom wasn't around, and his temper had for the most part seemed under control, I knew not to push things. In the best of circumstances, he'd dismiss any question about my mother's absence. Usually pinning the blame vaguely on her, and sulk in silence for hours afterward. During the worst, which came far more often, he wouldn't say a thing. Simply glaring at me before stewing in a silent rage that always felt like the quiet before a familiar storm. I'd never known him to blow up on me. In fact, it was usually the opposite. Growing up I was his princess, whom he seemed to feel needed to be protected from what he viewed as my mother's bad influence. He'd never put his hands on me, apparently reserving all the worst of his wrath for my mom, but she wasn't around now, and I wasn't going to take chances. Though he'd never yet been violent toward me, a part of me was always certain, deep down, that he was capable of it. During those months, a strange new reality began to settle in, and with it, a new day-to-day. It's strange how easily a child can adjust to a whole new way of life. It's funny how malleable you are at that age. No matter how strange or peculiar the new situation may be, children just assume the adults in their life know best, and adjust, allowing it to be their new normal. I was homeschooled on the days my father wasn't working an odd job or construction gig. When he was, I occupied my time reading the books he would bring me back from town in the trailer. Above all, I was expected to stay on the property, told never to wander too far from the trailer. The hours home alone would grow boring, and in the boredom, I found the perfect breeding ground for longing. My mind would turn to thoughts of my mother and my old life. I missed my mother, my old room, and my old home, though I knew better than to express as much to my father, who never took well to discussion of our past life as he called it. I would try and stave off the longing, flipping through the tiny picture book I had managed to sneak from my room when I'd packed, struck by an odd urge at the time. It contained my favorite photo of my mother and father, from months before I was born at their wedding. I had always thought my mother looked like such a princess in the image, her white dress and long brown hair that I had always taken after, styled beautifully, a far cry from the usual exhausted mother appearance. When that failed to suffice, I took to wandering that skeleton of a house that stood like a surfacing corpse beside us as a distraction. Despite my father's many warnings against its safety, there was something about the creaky old shell of a home, slowly filling out day by day into something livable, that filled me with an odd sort of comfort as I wandered its halls. That all changed one day, entirely without warning save for my father ripping out much of the foundation of the house. He had been returning home from work visibly stressed more and more recently. He'd been more insistent than ever that I stay within the clearing, not even venturing out into the forest anymore. Any questions on my part were dismissed with a brief safety in reply. Then, one day, father didn't come home on time. 5 o'clock came and went, sunset soon following, and he hadn't returned. It wasn't until long after dark, and I'd fallen asleep rife with worry, that I heard the crunch of his tires on the gravel path leading up to our lot. He didn't even come to the trailer, going straight for the ghastly form of the house, far more ominous in the moonlight, a sledgehammer over his shoulder. That was the first night of his digging. I watched from the window as he entered the house, and began slamming the head of his hammer into the concrete. The quiet of the forest was pierced by the constant thud of metal on cement, chipping away slowly. I fell asleep that night to the incessant, almost haunting clack of his hammer against the newly laid concrete. It's not right, not yet. The cement was too porous. The whole thing would have sunk over time. He'd offered briefly an explanation when I questioned him at breakfast the following morning about what I'd seen the night prior. I knew something was wrong though. The woods didn't feel the same after that day, and the house even less so. Suddenly, its halls felt so hollow, foreboding. In the days following that night, when I was home alone, and the wind whistled through the hollow halls, I was certain I could hear a voice singing. There was a woman, her words indistinct, but an immeasurable sadness present in her tone as it echoed in the frigid air of the night. It was around this time that the dreams began plaguing me. They were always the same. There was me, the house, and a woman. The house stood like the remnants of something old and dead. Its wooden frame was replaced with pale bone, and thin veins running in place of the errant wires. And at the center of the basement, she always stood. The woman in white, her face covered with a veil so thin and ethereal in the wind it appeared made of spider silk. She sang a song so sad, so familiar that it always sent a pang of sorrow through my heart. I approached, a sense of unshakable familiarity driving me forth. My hand would reach out for her veil, half expecting my fingers to tear through it at contact, and I always woke up. My face would be wet with tears, and an air of dread would cling to me for several minutes. I learned very quickly not to mention the woman, the voice, or the dreams to my father, after his reaction that following morning. I'd never seen him so pale when I brought it up, his face screwed, and his head seemed to turn on instinct to cast a glance down the hallway. He busied himself that entire day, refilling the ruined basement floor with cement and sequestering me to the trailer for safety reasons. For the next few months, things progressed as normally as could be expected. The dreams continued, eventually becoming an accepted part of life. Thoughts of my mother plagued me, all the questions I couldn't ask piling up. I missed her. I wondered if she knew where we were. I doubted it. Even at that age, I could now understand that my father kept me cooped up here for a reason. That summer, my father made a few friends on one of his latest jobs, and they helped him finally finish its construction. I watched as covertly as I could from the window of the trailer, staying out of sight whenever they were around, per my father's orders. He was so proud in those final months of its construction. Now, we truly get to leave it all behind," he would say, gripping my hand. The look in his eyes was always so desperate, pleading, as though he were trying to convince himself. Then he'd wipe it all away with a smile as he looked on at the rapidly forming house before us. By the end of the summer, the house was complete. It was a modest, 2-story house, painted a vibrant yellow, which had been the color of my choice. It was a far cry from the castle my father had initially promised, but it was a home and was surely going to be a step up from the beat-up old trailer. We spent the following weeks transforming the empty shell of a house into something of a home. Painting the walls in the small living room a regal sort of mahogany, my own room covered in facsimiles of unicorns, golden-haired princesses, and other things my father saw as being fit for a little girl's room. The dreams continued in the weeks following our move into the house, but they changed in subtle, but disquieting ways. For one, the woman's song now didn't sound quite so distant. From the very first night we spent in the house, I had the dream of the woman. It was different this time, her voice seeming not to come from somewhere outside, but carrying through the pitch-black halls of the house. It was as though the sound originated from somewhere deep within. The way it seemed to almost carry through the walls, airy and chilling, as though the house itself were singing her somber tune. Over that time, I was constantly exhausted. My father started to notice something was wrong, as I nodded off during dinners, but he obviously couldn't begin to suspect what. I often gave the excuse of not being used to my new room, which seemed to quell his worries. He bought the first TV we'd owned since leaving home. It was a cheap thing, but I was thrilled to have something besides books to entertain myself with, and he was fine with that so long as I avoided adult programs and only used it under his supervision. There were other effects of my lack of sleep. Ones that were odd, and harder to justify to myself. I was beginning to hear that strange singing even in my waking hours. Whenever I was just about to nod off, it would start, as if my dreams were beginning just a tad too early. I learned quickly not to react too much when the singing began its echo from behind our basement door. It was clear that, whatever it was, Father couldn't hear it. Time began to lose its meaning after almost 2 years. My sleep schedule was shot, and paired with the fact that Father insisted I remained within our little section of the woodland, my mind remained constantly in an odd haze. So when I began seeing the woman in white in my waking hours, I could only question my own eyes. Like her song, I tried to ignore her when I caught sight of her pale, incorporeal form. She moved through the halls, her form like the static of a television, cloudy and fuzzy like she was made of snow. Where she passed, the dull red of the wall seemed to rot and decay, revealing necrotic muscle and tissue beneath. She would drift by, singing that song that felt so familiar, until she reached the basement door. Always the basement door. There she would wait, turning her head to watch me as if waiting for me to open it. For months, I never did. I tried my best to act as though I saw nothing at dinner, when it seemed she appeared the most, keeping my eyes locked on my father as she'd wander past, on her way to the basement door. If I waited long enough, she would disappear, fading into nothingness. On some particularly disconcerting occasions, she stood behind him, staring down at him through that veil. Though I couldn't see her face, I could feel hate radiating from her. She remained like that until Father had left the table, at which point she continued on to the basement door. As time seemed to pass in a blur, my resolve began to wane. My father began to catch my gaze wandering more and more, often roaming as if following something he couldn't see. I could tell it was freaking him out by the worried looks he'd shoot me, or the way his gaze would fall on the basement door. When the night came that I finally broke, my father was away. As the construction season passed, he'd taken a job a few nights a week at a local warehouse that kept him away from home until the early morning hours. The house was mine in those hours, yet never was I allowed the luxury of feeling alone. Even when I couldn't see her, I could hear her, a waking dream superimposed over reality. I was eating alone at the dinner table, the TV blaring some local news channel in the other room to stave off the silence, when her song began. I tensed out of instinct, doing my best to keep my eyes on my food as her form drifted into the room. My father was gone, which meant there was one place she would head, as she did so often. The basement. I watched from my peripheral as she moved past the other end of the table. Perhaps it was a year's worth of exhaustion and rising paranoia finally making me break, but her song, that strange, hauntingly familiar words always just out of reach, I felt like I knew it. I slowly chewed the chicken from my microwavable dinner, and two things occurred to me almost simultaneously, like lights flicked on in the darkness. One was an idea, the other a dawning realization. I dropped my fork. Before I could even consider my next actions, I was up from the table, pushing the chair back, and rounding the table. She stood, flickering like an old movie outside of the basement door. For once, I looked, not bothering to try and hide the fact as I approached. I think by that point, a part of me already knew that the woman was no mere effect of exhaustion. She was real, or at least not limited to my imagination. I had always tried to justify the faint creaking of floors as she passed over them, but I always knew. My heart raced like a jackrabbit in my chest, a smell reminiscent of when I sat inches from our old box set as a kid, singeing my nostrils. The paint on the walls seemed to bruise, turning yellow, and then gray as they rotted with her passing. Before I could think, I reached out and touched the nearest wall, running my finger along it as I approached. It was wet and brittle to the touch, a thin trail of clear slime extending with me as I pulled back. She froze, coming to a stop at her usual destination, and turned to watch me expectantly. A cold dread sunk its claws into me as I stared into that veil, holding me in place for a moment. I mustered the fleeting wisps of courage I had. With a sigh, I pulled open the basement door. Her reaction was immediate. She shot forward, passing through my arm as though it were nothing. I yanked it back, gasping as an icy wave of pins and needles filled the limb. Her head tilted just slightly, as though curious about my reaction, but she turned in an instant, disappearing in a faint glow into the darkness below. I know no rational person would have followed, but I was young and that curious familiarity seemed to pull me forth. It was odd to think, but I almost felt more comfortable with the phantom woman at this point than I had around my father since the night he'd returned with the hammer. Something about him had just seemed different. I followed the woman into the basement, the steps groaning underfoot. A dank, damp smell had already come to fill the air, intermingling with the dust left by construction. With each creak of the steps as I approached the cold floor beneath, the knot of anxiety in me pulled itself tighter. A feeling of dawning dread starting to eke past the patchwork wall of bravery I'd built. I waved my hand blindly for the string attached to the singular light bulb in the basement, eventually finding it, and pulling. Nothing. A second and third pull returned the same results. The woman's faint song rose from behind me. I turned to face her. Her faint glow illuminated the other half of the room. I shuddered. It would have to be enough. Slowly, I began to approach her. She was kneeling, head lowered into her hands, as she sat before a spot on the concrete. I recognized it immediately. It was a slightly off shade of gray, different from the rest of the room. Newer. The sound of that incessant clattering, my father's hammer against concrete, rang in the back of my mind. So much had changed that night. It had been after that the woman's song began to haunt me. It had seemed to be yet another point in my life at which things had taken a turn for the unfortunate, a strange catalyst for a dark shift. The catalyst for all of it being the night my father took me from my home. The woman raised her head from her hands as I approached, staring up at me with that same silent expectance that she possessed, waiting outside of the basement. What do you need me to do?" I asked, my voice shaking with desperation and the ever-present, instinctual sort of horror always at the back of my mind as I stood in the presence of the impossible. She lifted her arm, pointing one pale, unclear finger towards a dark corner of the room, illuminating it as though holding a pale blue candle. In it the corner leaned my father's sledgehammer. It took only seconds before I understood what I was being instructed to do, what I had been called to do for months. I made my way to the corner, gripping the handle of the thing in my small hands. I strained, kneeling as I lifted the hammer from its corner, maneuvering it around and over my shoulder, before approaching her again. The woman stood, a fluid, almost instant motion, as if she'd moved from one still to another, stepping to the side of the strange point in the cement. The air buzzed with indescribable energy, thick with a tension caused by the presence of something impossible and the sheer insanity of what I was engaged in. I stared at the woman for a moment, almost trying to peer beneath that veil, unsure for a moment of what I was about to do. She gave me the briefest nod, and in that instant I felt certain of what I must do. I raised the hammer as high as I could manage, swaying lightly under the weight, and brought it down with a clank of metal on concrete. A few chips of cement broke off, but little else. I did it again, and again. The progress was slow, almost negligible at first, and though I wondered if I was even making progress, I was spurred forth by the woman's gaze. There was something down there. I suppose I might have realized that deep down, the night my father took to it with a sledgehammer, his excuse always seeming lackluster. I continued like that for hours, until my palms were slick with blood and sweat, tearing open from the friction. I was drenched, my hair clinging to my forehead, and my pajamas to my skin. My arms were on fire, but I continued, hours passing, until eventually, I had made a significant dent in the concrete. There was something there, visible just beneath the dust and debris. It was wrapped in cloth, white at one point, now stained a deep, rotten gray. The smell hit me immediately. I dropped the hammer at my side, stumbling away as my knees buckled and my eyes watered. The cold pit that had been present inside of me from the moment my father woke me up in my room stretched until it enveloped me. The stench was like meat long gone bad, almost like the cat that had been hid outside of my house when I was little and left out for the summer sun. It was death. Pure and unfiltered. I felt tears running down my face, and fought off the urge to relieve my bladder as my body shook in response to the smell. The woman turned and faced me, and in an instant, she stood before me. One of her hands rose to my face, and I started to cry, but she continued, holding it as close to my face as she could without passing through it. I could feel a radiating coolness from her, faint but there, and she kneeled until her veil was only inches from my face. She began to sing that familiar wordless hymn of hers. It echoed through the empty room, filling my mind with a sudden, much-needed calm. I felt my heartbeat slow, and my breathing returned to a steady pace. Upon seeing my reaction, she turned her head towards the crater I'd made. When she turned back, I knew what she wanted me to do. I nodded, steeling myself and moving towards the reeking hole in the ground. She followed at my side, and it brought me a comfort I hadn't felt in years. I kneeled at the side of the fabric, holding my nose with one hand, and reaching out to grab at the edge of the cloth with the other. I pulled it aside. My heart dropped, and my stomach flipped in my gut. There was the head of a corpse beneath, petrified, its gray skin clinging to the bone, and its hair. Its hair was almost a reflection of my own long dark locks. "Mommy," I breathed the word, my throat tightening, tears springing forth. I turned my head to face the woman who had been haunting my dreams, searching for some sort of answer. As I looked to her, the veil over her face always obscuring her features began to dissipate, fading like smoke in a breeze. And the pale, almost blurry countenance of my mother stood before me. She gazed down at her body, a look of sadness noticeable in the faint visual snow of her features as she looked at me. And all at once, recognition bloomed, and everything clicked. The familiarity of her song, a song whose words I'd long since lost to time, but whose tone I would always remember as the lullaby my mother sang to me when I was younger. I'd seen her pale dress before as well, in the singular photo I'd managed to bring from home. It had always made her look like royalty. My stomach turned, as I realized why my father had been acting so suspicious. He had killed her. He had killed my mother, burying her beneath my very feet. I felt like I might be sick. "Mommy," I breathed again, an overwhelming mix of sadness, longing, and hope filling me all at once. She kneeled until her face was at my level, a sad smile spreading across her features. "Why? Why did you make me do this?" She frowned, her colorless eyes somehow glistening with emotion at that. It confused me at the time, but in hindsight I imagined she needed me to know. Needed me to understand I wasn't safe with my father. It immediately occurred to me that her color seemed to be fading. That otherworldly sort of pale blue was now a faint white, like a light being gradually lowered. I could feel somehow that I had done it. Whatever it was she required of me, my mother, what remained of her at least, was not long for this world. Her face fell, then screwed in an instant. A look of fury blazed over her expression. My heart almost burst from my chest. She turned to face the basement door, then turned back to me, her expression stern. She extended one rapidly fading hand towards the singular window in the basement, leading into a window well outside. From somewhere upstairs a door slammed shut. "Bryn? Where are you, baby?" My heart sank as though thrown in quicksand, as my father's voice carried down the stairs. I felt a fear, unlike anything I have felt since, shock my system as I glanced back at the body of my mother. I couldn't know what he might do to me for uncovering it, and I didn't want to. He had killed my mother, there was no telling what he might be capable of doing to me. The realization that my father had become someone unrecognizable to me was a chilling one. I had left the table in a hurry, leaving my food nearly untouched and the basement door wide open. If he came looking, which I was certain he would, it would be a brief matter of time. That icy burst of pins and needles exploding in the skin of my back drew my attention, and I turned to see what was left of Mother gesturing frantically at the window, her meaning finally clicking. "Bryn, are you down there? I've told you it's not safe." Father's voice carried from nearby. He couldn't be too far from the basement door now, just a bit of hallway and some steps still separating us. I hurried over to the window, wincing with each slap of my feet on the concrete. I began to fumble with the lock, each of my father's approaching footsteps from the floor above making my heart leap farther into my throat. Finally, it twisted with a pop, and I slid the window open, letting in a rush of the frigid night air. "Brinley!" His voice was louder now, hoarse with a blend of rising anger and panic. The phantom woman, my mother, watched me with a longing expression as she kneeled beside her own exposed corpse. Her eyes communicating everything she was unable to say. "I love you too, Mama." She nodded her head once, pointing again at the open window. I climbed out, standing up in the window well and shooting her one last glance. She kneeled, almost prostrating until her face was within inches of her corpse. Its mouth snapped open as if some invisible string had been yanked, and in that instant, with one last glance my way, she was gone, disappearing inside the mouth of the corpse, which snapped shut behind her. A faint, dull glow seemed to settle just beneath its skin, and for just a moment, I could see her laying there as she used to be. Her beautiful face merely sleeping, and then it was gone. The glow fading, leaving only the dried husk. "Brinley Jane Adams, answer me, damn it." My eyes widened with cold panic. He was coming, just at the top of the stairs now by the sounds of it. The thump of footfalls on the basement stairs sprung me into action, spurring me forth like a frightened animal. I strained to pull myself out of the window well. My arms felt hot and full of sand after my hours with the sledgehammer. I scrambled for some purchase along the rigid metal walls with my feet, eventually managing to boost myself up enough to slowly begin rising onto the ground above. It was dark out, and the forest around me was pitch black with the exception of the faint light glowing from the windows of the house. I groaned as I pulled myself out of the window well, out onto the ground, but had little time to catch my breath. "Oh God, oh my God," I could hear his voice, his stunned whisper just a few feet away in the room beneath me. He was in the basement now, surely seeing my mother's corpse uncovered, and the open window mere feet away. "Brinley." He sounded unhinged, his voice seeming to shake the walls around him. I pulled myself to my feet and ran. Twigs and crinkling leaves announced the sudden burst of movement as I peeled off towards the tree line, which had for years symbolized the border edge of my entire world. "Brinley, please. I did it for you, baby. Your mom, she was sick. She thought I might hurt you, and she wanted to take you away, but Bryn, you know Daddy would never hurt you, right?" His voice pleaded from behind me, at points wavering with exertion. I chanced a glance behind me as I rounded the corner of the house, heading off towards the gravel path that served as our driveway, just in time to see my father pulling himself to his feet where I just stood outside of the window well. Our eyes met briefly, his glistening with tears and an unfamiliar madness. My heart pounded in my chest, and my lungs burned, the bottoms of my bare feet beginning to sting from the pebbles, twigs, and detritus of the forest. "Brinley," he practically shrieked my name, "Brinley, I did it for you." He was gaining on me. I could tell by the rapid approach of his unhinged screaming. Despite my best efforts, I was half the size of my father, and without my shoes running was growing excruciating. I had to think of something quickly. I veered off, hoping my father wouldn't emerge in time to see where I was heading, racing off towards the old trailer. It had been all but untouched since the house was built, a rotting memory stood on cinder blocks. I quickly crawled beneath, and held my breath, watching the corner I'd rounded. My father emerged seconds later. His eyes were wide and wild, searching frantically through the surrounding brush. His hair was slicked with sweat and clung to his forehead in wet clumps. In his hand, he gripped a blade. I didn't want to know what he intended to do with it. "How did you know?" He moaned into the darkness, his voice wavering as he sobbed the question. "Was it those dreams? Huh? Did your bitch of a mother fuck me over just one more time from beyond the grave?" He spun as he spoke, eyes practically bulging as they scanned the darkness, and face a deep red, jaw clenched and teeth bared as spittle flew. I clasped my hand over my mouth, praying for my very heartbeat and breathing to be silenced. He shook with emotion, unmitigated rage, and an unhinged sadness. He screamed, loud and raw, kneeling down for a moment with his head between his hands, and my heartbeat practically froze as we stood almost at eye level. To my luck, he stood, never bothering to look beneath the trailer. "Brinley, I know you can hear me out there. I tried my best for you, baby, I really did. I tried to make sure you didn't grow up like her, that you were good and obedient, but I'm sorry, baby, I don't think I can help you," he muttered, head lowered in his hands. "No matter what I do, half of you comes from her, and maybe you always were hers." His eyes snapped up, right at the trailer. He rose, his hand working nervously around the hilt of the blade, and rounded the trailer, opening the door. He thought I was inside. This was my chance. I carefully slid out from beneath the trailer on the opposite side as I heard the door shut behind him. I was no more than 20 yards from the tree line. If I could disappear into the woods, I could find my way back to the road eventually. It was risky, I knew he could potentially see me from the windows of the trailer, but staying put felt far riskier. Taking a breath, I slid out from beneath the trailer and darted for the trees. I was just passing the first line of old oaks when I heard the door slam behind me and the clamor of movement. "Brinley, come here, baby girl, I'm not mad, I understand now you were never going to be mine, always hers, always poisoned by her sickness. But that's okay, Daddy's gonna help you see Mommy again, I promise, it'll be easy. Just stop running." I felt jagged rocks and sharp twigs tear into my feet, but I didn't slow down, racing through the forest as branches whipped at my face and eyes. "Come here, you little bitch," he roared, the familiar, unhinged anger I used to see during his and my mother's arguments finally taking full control. Father was bigger, faster, and angrier. But for me? I had been stuck on that property for years since we'd moved, limited only to the surrounding woods for any semblance of adventure. I knew them better than he did. There was a gulch approaching, through which a small stream ran. Farther down the way a large cement pipe opened up into it, big enough for me to crawl into. The sound of breaking branches and earth trampled underfoot grew behind me, my father screaming a wordless, rage-filled scream. I let myself slide down the gulch, landing in the little stream below, pulling myself onto its banks, and ran until I reached the pipe, crawling inside. The faint trickle of water echoed through the long dark tunnel, and a wet, damp smell filled the air. I stayed quiet. Footsteps approached from somewhere outside, and I felt my heart soar into my throat, threatening to suffocate me there, as they drew nearer. The sound of water being disturbed as someone trudged through it made me freeze, right as a pair of legs appeared outside of my hiding spot. I held my breath, knowing my life likely depended on it. "Brinley, you come back here, damn it." I jumped but managed to stay quiet. "Brinley," he called again, voice lower, raw with emotion. He stayed out there for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes, moaning my name like some phantom as he roamed the woods in search of me. The moment he left the spring, I was gone, darting through the woods regardless of the injuries to my feet, refusing to stop until I reached the nearest active road. I nearly got myself killed throwing myself in front of the beams of the approaching pickup, signaling them to stop. Luckily they managed to stop a mere foot away from me. "Well, now what in the fuck are you?" think the driver began, a big, burly sort of guy with a thick red beard. He paused as soon as he got a good look at me. I must have looked like a mess. A 12-year-old girl covered in sweat and filthy water, clothes torn from prying branches, feet bleeding, and eyes red and puffy. I offered the best, brief, explanation that I could. The truth. My father had killed my mother and was now trying to kill me, leaving out the unnecessary details for time and a doubt that it would make me seem anything other than crazy. I suppose I was lucky I hadn't stumbled into a worse creep. The man immediately drove me to the local police station, even giving me his jacket to stay warm on the drive after seeing me shiver while we drove. I didn't bother to mention it wasn't from the cold. When we arrived at the station, the cop at the desk's eyes widened upon seeing me, her face going pale at first. "Holy shit," she breathed, "Brinley Adams?" I nodded, confusion and exhaustion covering my thoughts in a haze. "You're alive," she breathed as if looking at a ghost. She stood from her chair, giving the man a questioning look, causing him to raise his arms in a placating gesture and begin explaining. "I just found her on the side of the road, almost hit the damn kid. She was a mess." The woman rounded her desk, kneeling in front of me. "Brinley, you've been missing for almost 2.5 years, ever since the night your father..." She trailed off, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Killed my mom," I finished, eyes glazing as the words seemed to finally hit home. She nodded, pressing her lips into a thin line. "I know this is going to be hard, but one of the other officers is going to take you to a room and ask you some questions, okay? I need you to tell us what happened these last few years." I did. The woman called her colleagues, and before long the precinct was abuzz with news of my return. Apparently, my disappearance had become something of a minor phenomenon in the area, old reports of my being seen years prior stirring our ordeal into something of an urban legend. The morning after my father had taken me, my mother had reported the kidnapping and was raising hell to get me back. Her efforts were blowing the story up, and my face had apparently been on so many posters, billboards, and newsreels that I was something of a minor celebrity in the area. They couldn't be sure, but when my mother disappeared, they suspected my father had played a role, but with him still MIA, it was impossible to prove, and so the case of her murder, and my kidnapping, both fell cold. Until my miraculous return. By the end of the hour, officers had already been dispatched to my father's house in search of him. They found him in the basement alongside my mother, having repainted the walls with his brain and the business end of a shotgun. I spent some time in the foster care system before they eventually found my next of kin, a cousin of my mother's who was willing to take on the responsibility of raising me. As ridiculous as it seems to survive what I did, I lived a relatively good life, all things considered. My past would always be marred by the hideous scar of what I'd experienced, and my nightmares were plagued by half-remembered memories of phantom women and the sound of a sledgehammer, but I was alive, and each passing day was another handful of dirt on the coffin of that memory. Or it had been. I had been content to limit my recollection of the event for the odd therapy session. Never once would I have considered reliving it all in the form of a story, but, well, I guess I don't know what else to do. I'd almost convinced myself I'd misremembered much of the events. Through therapy and self-doubt, I'd been more than willing to rationalize the things I'd seen and heard as some convoluted coping mechanism my mind had devised to lead me to a conclusion I must have somehow known deep down, and provide the closure I needed. But now, I'm not so sure. It began last night. Last night, as sleep began to pull me into its murky depths, I heard something. Something eerily, unshakably familiar, that sent a cold chill down my spine. From somewhere outside of my house, amidst the surrounding forest, echoed a sound I recognized, wordless, but unmistakable. It was the rage-filled cry of a man, one I had heard many years before. My father. Hosted by YungSeti. A fog descended on the lake, and I was lost on an alien ocean. I write this with the fleeting hope that someone somewhere will be able to help me make sense of it all. All I want are answers, some understanding that would allow me to return to my previous undisturbed worldview. That lake sitting just beyond the edges of my yard had seemed an extension of the home to me. Now I feel as though it looms over me at night, threatening to let loose the unknowable horrors it holds. Before I was lost in that place, I would take every opportunity to be down at the lake. The water was like a second home. Now it seems so alien and unfamiliar. I will recount my experience to the best of my ability, and all I ask, all I hope is that someone can help me make sense of this. Please. I feel as though I can't trust my own reality, and the nightmares that fill what little sleep I have gotten have left me exhausted. My family had owned our home in the private community built around Lake Gannett in Massachusetts for longer than I'd been alive, and growing up I'd spent many summers there, under the watchful eye of my mother or aunt from the docks. My cousins and I would challenge each other to races out into the lake, always pushing the limits to see who would swim out the farthest. I would always win. The water had become a second home to me, somewhere I found comfort and familiarity, and years later, when my grandparents needed to move closer to my family, the house would come under my care. I'd lived here for years without incident, and I had intended for this to be the house I raised a family in one day. I intend to move, now, as soon as I can manage. Every second spent here wears on my nerves, which are already shot to hell, and I can't take it, the sight of the lake. It was overcast the morning it happened. Fresh drops of dew clung to the grass, which seemed a more lively green than usual, thanks to the weather. Spring was practically upon us, though winter was not so far removed, and the stubborn chill that seemed to cling to the air reminded me as much. I shivered involuntarily, pulling the collar of my windbreaker together with one hand, and shoved the other in a pocket as I moved through the backyard, towards the private path that leads to the lakeshore. Except for the birds, chirping messages back and forth to each other, I was the only living thing out this early, which was just as I preferred it. I opened the fence that separated my backyard from the path down to the waterfront and made my way down the stone steps descending the little hill the house sat on, and onto the sandy shore. The familiar sound of water meeting land greeted me, and I made my way over to a tarp on the beach, removing it to reveal a rather expensive handcrafted canoe that had belonged to my grandfather before me. I sucked in air, bending my knees to pull, and began dragging the canoe towards the edge of the water, and into its shallows. The frigid water sent a shock up my legs and across my skin, raising gooseflesh in its wake. The wind had picked up a bit, enough, so that little waves were moving across the surface of the lake. I waited, standing there in the shallows holding the canoe steady as it bobbed on the surface until just the right little swell in the water, and I raised myself up and into the boat, in as fluid a motion as I could manage, pushing off and away from shore. As if in response, a breeze rolled across the water, carrying the sweet smell of the morning air, bringing an unintentional smile to my face. I settled into the repetitive but relaxing act of rowing, alternating sides, and timing my breathing as I paddled forward. Another sudden breeze rocked me, rendering me unsteady for a moment before centering myself again. I frowned slightly, wondering if perhaps I'd underestimated the weather for the morning. I had elected to wear my windbreaker but had little else on other than the swim trunks and sandals I usually wore on the water, and I was beginning to believe that would not be sufficient. As if in response to my worries, an unexpectedly strong gust of wind whipped from behind, throwing the thin hood of the windbreaker over my eyes, and pushing the canoe forward nearly 20 feet. I fought to balance myself against such sudden movement, almost losing my paddle before managing to regain some level of stability. I chuckled nervously to myself, imagining how foolish I must look to any neighbor who happened to be looking outside their window right now, watching me struggle against the air. It was an embarrassing thought and one that made me feel oddly vulnerable alone on the lake. It was that feeling that made me cast a glance back to shore. It was then that I saw the first sign that something was amiss. I'd been out on the lake for no longer than 5 minutes, and I was sure I'd seen the shore sooner than that. Still, in seemingly no time, a wall of fog that looked more like thick white smoke had descended over the neighborhood, creeping closer to the lake with every second, until obscuring my view of land entirely. Perhaps the decrease in visibility triggered some animal fear in me, or something deep down inside of me understood the true nature of what was to come, but as the fog drew closer and an eerie stillness fell over the water, the seeds of panic began to take root in my mind. I quickly resolved to return to shore. Being on the water, even a lake as familiar as this, wouldn't be safe with such a lack of visibility, as the fog crept ever closer, bringing with it an unnatural silence that caused the hairs on my back to raise. I reoriented, paddling until I'd turned the canoe around in the direction I had come. By now, my home stood only as a shadow in the mist, which had now almost engulfed the entirety of the lake. I watched as the last visible bit of the dock disappeared, the fog spilling over it in a way that almost felt purposeful. I shivered, not from the cold this time, though it felt like the temperature had dropped a few degrees, but rather from the growing sensation of wrongness with the entire situation. It was then, I think, when I first heard it. Had it not been so unnaturally quiet, I probably wouldn't even have heard it over the sounds I made while rowing, but there. From somewhere in that alien fog, I could have sworn I had heard a distinct splash. I paused, staying as still as I could manage, drifting silently on the water. There was nothing for a while, but the sound of the canoe floating on the water and my intentionally slowed breathing, as I waited for something to break the strange silence. I waited there for what must have been minutes, met only with silence, before eventually giving up and continuing forward. Almost as soon as my paddle touched the water, the noises returned, a series of repetitive sloshing sounds from somewhere behind me. Confusion quickly gave way to worried realization as the noise became more apparent, and less distant with each passing second, and I came to understand what I was hearing. Someone, somewhere in the strange mist that had descended on the lake, was swimming. A creeping sense of unease found itself firmly planted in my mind as I sat there for a few moments, listening to the unmistakable sound of something moving through the water. For a moment, I considered calling out, eager to know which of my neighbors could be out on the water in conditions such as the ones at hand, but the idea of calling into the phantom mists with no real concept of who, or what I may be calling out to quickly faded from my mind. I instead returned to paddling, with much added fervor, in the direction I had come, to what I was sure must be the shores leading to my backyard. I don't know exactly when, but at some point, I realized I had been rowing for far too long. I was as familiar with the lake as I was my own home, and even plunged into the ghostly haze I knew I should have reached land in any direction, several minutes ago. I swallowed and tried to force down the great swell of fear rising within me. For every second I went with no sign of land, my movements grew more rigorous and primal, more desperate. Come on, I pleaded with the nothingness, begging for it to part and reveal the familiar shorelines behind my home. An ancient cocktail of adrenaline and fear began searing its way through my veins, and within minutes I had started rowing with such an increased wildness that water drenched me as well as the inside of the boat. Time stretched on for a while, as did the lengths of my desperation for every second I progressed without seeing land. At some point, an idea occurred to me, one that I tried to stifle at first, but that quickly grew into something close to the irrefutable fact that longer I spent on that godforsaken water. Somehow I knew, even blinded by the fog, I knew that I had left the lake. That I was somewhere else. I didn't want to accept it, I couldn't make sense of it. My mind fought, struggled to reject what I knew to be the truth, terror gripping my every action, driving me forward with a wild fury. I don't know how long I continued on like that. Panic made the time seem to stretch and condense into something meaningless, and with no visual aid to mark my movements, it could have been a long time. However long, it was enough time for the memory of whatever I had heard earlier to fade to the back of my mind, as hysteria took hold of me. It resurfaced, racing to the forefront of my worries when again I heard it. Someone, or as I would come to find something, could be heard moving through the water again, faster this time. My head snapped around in the direction of the sounds, my ears perking involuntarily, as whatever was in the water approached, closing the distance. I froze, terror robbing me of control over my body, as I sat, eyes locked on the mist, waiting for something to break through at any moment. I had only just begun to consider that I was somewhere other than home, somewhere strange, and for some reason, the possibility of encountering something from wherever that was, filled me with a fear that made my stomach turn. For several agonizing moments, the longest few of my life, fear and ignorance made my mind illogical, and my thoughts began to swim with images of unseen horrors leaping out of the mist. My chest began to burn, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I didn't dare to stop, as the sound is closer now, so close I can feel the hair down my neck raising, and goosebumps forming along my skin. Slowly a shadow revealed itself, a dark form emerging from the pure haze of nothingness. My heart felt ready to leave my chest as my eyes strained to create something of the approaching darkness. The sound grew slower, the closer it drew, as the image in front of me grew clearer. I let out a breath, relief flooding through me, extinguishing the blazing panic that had gripped me. From the fog, the outline of a person became apparent. I chuckled, an inadvertent smile coming to my face as the realization dawns on me that I must not have been the only person out for an early morning ride on the lake. Sure, it was odd given the time of day, and I couldn't imagine how they could have gotten in without me seeing them, but nothing else made sense. Someone else was stuck here, wherever here was, along with me. The thought gave me some semblance of comfort in a moment steeped in so much fear. It wouldn't last. The person in the mist approached slowly, their figure growing more defined by the second, and I cleared my throat to speak, hoping to dispel the last bit of fear clouding my mind. "Hello?" My words seemed to hang there on the air, clinging to the phantom like mist. Somehow, the silence that followed seemed denser and more suffocating than before, as my anticipation for a response quickly morphed into regret at my ever having spoken. The figure in the mist continued their advance forward, silent if not for the gentle whisper of the water undertow, as they drew closer. I squinted, confusion growing as the dark form in the mist grew more evident, as strange details became more apparent. As the figure closed the distance, question after question sprouted in my mind, each plunging me further into a state of confusion even more mystifying than the strange fog I found myself trapped in. Closer and closer it came, and as it drew nearer, unsettling details began to leap out at me, creating an uncanny image of something I couldn't quite understand. Two, in specific, disturbed me more than the rest. The first, and least striking of the details, was the strange way the figure waved at me. The motion was clunky, as if made by someone unfamiliar with their appendages, still trying to master their use. It was odd, alien and uncomfortable, causing me to recoil away from the seemingly friendly gesture. The second and most gut-wrenching of the things I noticed was the figure's boat, or more accurately lack thereof. It seemed to glide through the water, attached to something just below the surface beyond my vision. The water, when had it gotten so dark? The lake, usually crystal clear and beautiful, was now an inky black that resembled oil more than water. I rubbed my eyes vigorously as if they were solely responsible for what I was seeing, my mind growing even more assured in my assertion that I was now somewhere else, somewhere far away. It was close. How close it was impossible to know for sure, but close enough that it became more and more evident that I was looking at something absurd, something impossible. The figure came to a stop, unnaturally abrupt, just a few feet in front of me. The tension that followed was thicker than the surrounding mist, and held me more captive, as the phantom in the fog remained motionless, impossibly still on the surface of the obsidian water. We remained like that for close to a minute, locked on each other, deadlocked, seemingly awaiting the other's response. Something about its observation, about the feeling in the air around it, made my skin crawl uncontrollably. Without warning, it jerked its arm forward, gripping for me hungrily. It was enough to stir me to action. I ducked away, just barely avoiding its grasping arm, which reached far longer than anything humanly possible. In one swift motion, I swung the paddle, batting the thing's arm away, before returning it to the water. I began to row away from the figure, carried forward by adrenaline and stomach-turning terror. I must have been a few yards away when I chanced to glance behind me, and my blood froze. The fog had begun to lift, just enough for me to see the figure, which had appeared so human moments ago, do something impossible. It descended, slowly, purposefully, beneath the black surface of the water, and out of sight once more. I don't know what I had expected to see. Somewhere in the recesses of my mind, I think I had already accepted that whatever it wasn't human. Still, at that moment, confronted with the reality of the situation so suddenly, all I could think of was an escape. Of escaping that thing, the fog, and the waking nightmare that the lake had become. I don't know how long I went on for after my brush with the thing in the mist. Maybe a few hours. Maybe longer. But I became extremely aware of just how tired, hungry, and cold I was. I'd been on the water for hours, much longer than I had anticipated that morning, and I had eaten a light breakfast, and not knowing when I would have access to food again, seemed to only make my stomach growl louder and more frequently, so I tried to avoid the thought entirely, though I was unsuccessful, and the idea of starving to death, slowly wasting away into an unrecognizable husk in this unforgiving place clawed at the back of my mind, slowly eating away at my thoughts. Eating away at my sanity. A familiar noise somewhere off to the front of me pulled me from the border of my breaking point. It was a noise I was used to hearing out on the lake all those times. The stressed creak of the wooden dock, shifting in the moving water. I sprang up, the canoe shifting violently under my weight, the familiar sound breathing new life into spaces previously occupied by hopelessness. I hear it, closer now, the sound as familiar as ever close, but still just out of sight. I paddled desperately in the direction of the sound, in the direction of the dock that meant salvation. A return to the world I knew. I know this doesn't make sense, but the lake knew what I was trying to do. And it wasn't going to just let me. A current, some fit for a busy river, began seemingly out of nothing, and with every passing moment, the creaking of the dock grew quieter. No, you fucking don't, I cried out at the lake, which I was now convinced somehow understood what it was doing, and was doing it on purpose. It was toying with me, and I wouldn't let it. I wasn't thinking, consumed with rage and madness like nothing I had ever experienced. I lost control, call it insanity, desperation. In reality, it was likely both, driven by a singular thought and motivation, no matter how illogical. Reach the dock. I don't know what I was thinking, I doubt I was truly thinking at all. I suppose in my mind the dock, being connected to the land, represented salvation, a link between the water and the world, and the only hope in my heart that I would ever escape this place and see my home again. It was a flimsy belief at best, but I had devolved past the point of sanity and rational decision, and belief was all it took to act. I dove from the canoe, which was immediately torn away by the strange current disappearing into the mist, as I plunged into the dark waters below. The dark water was beyond freezing, its biting cold, stinging my skin to the touch, instantly making me regret my decision. It seemed the changes to the water were more than just aesthetic, and I was beginning to lose the feeling in my fingers and toes. The strange current that had taken the canoe seemed not to be affecting me, though, and with a final burst of frantic energy, I managed to swim until I reached the familiar wooden structure that meant safety. As I pulled myself onto the dock, my heart sank through my chest, disappearing into the depths below. I crawled, every stir of the dock under my weight serving as a crushing confirmation of what I already knew. A scream, guttural and infuriated, tore through the air, echoing off the water and piercing the fog. It took a few seconds to realize it was coming from me. My throat was raw, and my skull pounded with pain, as I curled up in the center of the dock, floating uselessly in the center of this unknowably expansive sea of darkness, now an impromptu raft, my head buried in my legs, hands tangled in my hair. I was alone. The thought rang out so loud in my head that I was certain it had been spoken aloud. I pulled myself tighter, hoping that in this illogical place, perhaps I could make myself disappear if I pulled myself close enough, my heart and mind emptying of hope. It was almost expected when I heard the faint sounds of something in the distance, swimming closer, closer. I forced myself to sit up, staring forward into the mist, which seemed now to be clearing, as a familiar figure began to emerge. I sat up, backing slowly away toward the center of the dock raft, careful not to overturn it. I shivered, and I couldn't tell if it was from the freezing water or the way the feeling in the air seemed to shift with that thing's approach. The fog was fading, and some of the clarity seemed to be returning to the water, though in minimal amounts, revealing aspects of my surroundings to me. I quickly understood that the fog, the inky darkness of the water, was all protecting me, shielding me from the unimaginable reality of the situation. As the last of the mist dissipated, I felt the last bit of fight left in me drain from my body. I wasn't on the lake anymore. I didn't know if I was still on Earth anymore. The water stretched out in every direction, stopping only where it was met, but the sky, oh, that sky. The sky was a deep purple like a bruise, dotted with stars and the 3 massive moons that hung overhead, jarring indicators to just how far I was from anything I had ever known. If not for the situation, for my utter isolation on this alien ocean, it would have been beautiful. Instead, I felt only crushing horror as my mind struggled to process my impossible new reality. A fear that coursed through my veins, filling my body like poison as the figure from the mist was revealed. It's taken me a long time to find an adequate description of the thing I saw, the thing that had been stalking me through that mist. It's taken me time combing through images of the many awful things the oceans and lakes of the world have to offer, to find something, anything, like the thing I encountered in that lake. The closest thing I can compare it to is the anglerfish, the ugly thing with the jagged teeth and light on its forehead that it uses to attract prey, based on some of its main characteristics. I immediately understood why the figure seemed to glide along the water without a boat and why it moved so strangely. What I had seen was only a portion of the entire thing, a large fleshy appendage, human in shape and size, rising upwards and out of the water from the body of something unrecognizable. Its fish-like eyes were large and dark, each the size of a dinner plate, staring into mine with an eerie intelligence I found almost as horrifying as the rest of its appearance. Other human-shaped appendages grew from all along the surface of the nightmare creature, adopting a ghostly quality in the way they move in the water, all reaching and grabbing and snatching for something. The realization dawns on me what it is they're all reaching for. Me. I can hardly focus on the ephemeral dance of the figures sprouting from the creature, and its face, dear God, its fucking face. I couldn't look away. Its head was broad and fish-like, with rows of molar-like teeth open and waiting to devour. It was covered in a series of growths, these gray translucent appendages that appeared purposefully human-shaped. Thin bones ran through the thing's many limbs, responsible for their ability to somewhat articulate. The appendage that had been extending above the water that had been made to resemble a person in the mist reached one of its arms out at me, beckoning me forward. Somehow, the act dripped malice, and I realized it was mocking me. I stared down at the creature, the perverse horror floating just below, waiting to consume me. Its smile grew wider, and something flashed behind its glassy eyes. Somewhere inside of me, in the darkest parts of my mind, something was compelled to dive in after it. My head swam as a throbbing pain spreading through my brain, threatening to render me unconscious. Its eyes reminded me of the ocean I was lost in, dark, with something threatening lurking beneath the surface. It was in my head, I could feel it, somehow that thing from the depths was in my mind, dragging me into the hell below mentally. I struggled against the growing desire to let it take me, to be consumed by the beast, putting an end to it all. The thing brought its teeth together, glaring up at me with a stomach-turning smile that completely overtook the lower half of its face. The pain in my head intensified, as did the overwhelming desire to just fall in, end it. I moved forward, the dock beginning to run under my weight, threatening to flip entirely with my every movement. What little sanity remained in me pleaded and screamed for me to stop, to throw myself as far away from the edge from the abomination awaiting below. It was drowned out by the invading thoughts of the creature, pulling me closer. I inched closer, its smile widened. My fingers met the frigid water first, as I pulled myself forward. Closer. Closer. Without warning, the dock twisted under my weight, plunging me into the water. I was jolted back to awareness by the sudden burst of adrenaline, fresh terror searing through my veins as the awful realization of what was about to happen overtook me. Panic puppeteered my every move as I thrashed forward, trying desperately to reach the dock, which had again come to represent salvation. Behind me, something began to swim forward. I chanced a glance over my shoulder, and any hopes of survival were quickly quelled. The figure above the water was merely feet away, closing in rapidly. I clenched my teeth, stopping in the water, bracing myself. I was going to die on some alien ocean somewhere unthinkable. I would never know why or how I got there, and I was going to die there. The thing in the water seemed aware of my thoughts, and its smile grew even wider in response, as its mouth began to hang open as the distance between us began to disappear. I closed my eyes and awaited the inevitable end. I felt the spray of water as it drew near, and sucked in a final breath. The following seconds seemed to stretch on for an eternity. I waited for something, for some blinding pain, or some bright light as I entered the next life. There was nothing, just the sound of the lake, and my labored breathing. For several agonizing moments, I refused to open my eyes, unwilling to confront the sight of that thing again. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear, and I chanced a glance. It was stopped, utterly motionless just feet in front of me, eerily still. I was frozen, terrified that any movement may send it back into frenzied pursuit and lead to my death. Something about the look in the eyes of the creature, something I couldn't quite place, made me feel as though perhaps I could take the chance. Slowly, I began kicking my feet, moving back towards the dock, keeping my eyes locked on the thing. I hit my back against the wood, sending a shock down my spine, that instantly gave way to relief upon the realization that I had reached the dock. I quickly pulled myself on top of it, my eyes never leaving the creature, which remained motionless under the water. The thing's smile faded so suddenly it made my heart drop, and the corner of its mouth curled into a horrible pain grimace. What it did next was the most surprising, and would come to be the most immediately foreboding. As quickly as it had appeared, the creature lowered itself into the depths and disappeared. The confusion came as suddenly as the fear had, as I watched that nightmare of a being, a predator of some alien world, disappear. I fell back, a wave of exhaustion taking the place of the adrenaline that had been keeping me going, and I began to turn and survey my surroundings. The fog had mostly cleared, something I had barely taken mental note of being occupied with the creature from before, and I had yet to actually look around me. Had I looked earlier, I would have sooner noticed why the creature had fled. Land, the only for miles, had appeared, only yards away from where I was floating now. Like so much about the situation, something felt wrong about this. For the second time on this lake, the horror quickly revealed itself to me. I thought it was my eyes at first. Maybe a trick of the light in the waning fog, but I had thought I'd seen motion. I blinked once, praying to whatever God was out there to listen, praying for this all to stop. I think it answered, only it was the god of this place. And it was evil as everything else here. The island was covered with dark figures, thrashing and fighting and tearing at one another, in some sick frenzied ritual. All at once, the figures stopped, ceasing their vile performance, moving as if united by one mind. All at once, they gathered on the shores of this impossible island, and I could see what they truly were. They were humanoid, bipedal, 2 arms, all of that, but they were far from human. Their skin was a sickly gray color, with webbed hands and massive dark eyes like those on the creature from the depths. They chittered and clicked, flooding forward and off of the island in droves, a descending army of angry, hungry mouths. For a few seconds, before the fresh fear took hold, I wondered if these things were the results of what happened if you stayed here, lost in this place for too long. I imagined myself, a mindless animal gnashing and tearing at the others on the island, and shuddered. I preferred death. They spilled forward, and my heart quickened in preparation for the inevitable. I would be ripped apart by these creatures, the people of the lake, and the horror of that was one I was accustomed to. But what followed, I was unprepared for. It began with the water, which vibrated at first, then started to quake, waves starting to form along its surface. I had hardly noticed at first, only realizing what was going on when the creatures in the water ceased their press forward, chittering and cackling with such intensity it filled me with a dread I hadn't known I could experience as of yet. Then it shifted. I can't explain how I felt, what it was like watching it. The mass that had been home to the creatures, the island that had appeared so suddenly, shifted. The fog had ceased its retreat, pooling around the mass in the water ominously. I glanced at the creatures in the water. They had stopped their pursuit entirely, instead collectively turning their attention towards the shifting mass, something resembling fear on their faces which I now realized very much resembled the creature I had seen earlier. Another shift, more significant than before, encouraged a series of excited shrieks and cries from the creatures, who began thrashing, hooting, and yelling in some jubilant celebration. The island begins to rise. The nightmarish cacophony from the creatures in the water rose to a fever pitch, as the shadow of a behemoth stretched from the water to the sky, all under cover of that fog. The dock was lifted and thrown by a sudden wave of displaced water, tossed into the air. For a few moments, time seemed to slow. I watched the strange alien ocean descend into discordant waves, as angry dark clouds poured out of the fog surrounding the colossal creature, threatening to unleash hell. I saw the legions of creatures, almost human but still something so different, as they watched it all unfold, unable to gauge their emotions now. I don't know how high I was thrown, but when I connected with the water, it felt like hitting pavement. A ringing sound filled my ears, which only took in a lungful of water by mistake. Disoriented, I struggled to find direction, my lungs burning as I tried to navigate my way to the surface. I managed to find my way up by some miracle, gasping for air, vision blurry. The scene that came into focus was the least explainable of all. The creatures were rising from the water. Or, being pulled is a more accurate description of what I saw. In a stream of bodies, thrashing and struggling against some invisible power tearing them from the lake. The behemoth had reached its full height, its hulking figure towering above the water and into the purple skies above, enveloped in that strange fog. From the highest point of the beast, where a head should have been, a brilliant light began to beam, forcing me to avert my eyes for a moment. I squinted, watching as the smaller creatures began to disappear into the light. It's hard to tell exactly, but I get the feeling their excitement was gone, replaced with fear and confusion no different than my own. They had seemed to worship the behemoth, to revere it, which left me to wonder if this thing shrouded in fog and clouds was the awful god of wherever I was. The light began to intensify, emitting a palpable heat, and forcing me to look away. I didn't want to see it, to feel it rummaging through my mind like the creature from before had. The water around me had become increasingly violent, and the weather followed suit, a lightning in an array of unusual hues coloring the sky in a spectacle that was as beautiful as it was horrifying. I was tossed around, unable to avert my gaze from the behemoth. I found myself staring into the clouds above, into the light the monster emitted. I guess it's impossible to know for sure. Covered in the clouds like that, I couldn't have seen what it was really doing. But I felt it. In my mind, I felt it. It turned and looked at me. I was covered in something like a massive spotlight blinding me, filling my mind with images of voyages taken on an alien sea. I saw crews throughout the ages, across time and space, setting sail on oceans and lakes, taking swims in rivers and creeks, on Earth and worlds I didn't recognize, all finding themselves in the same situation, lost in a storm, or a strange and sudden fog, soon to find themselves stranded on an alien ocean. All meeting the same fate. One by one, falling victim to unknown, impossible horrors, lost forever in this place. I could feel my mind beginning to collapse under the sheer amount of information, and the images that followed fractured it completely. I couldn't take any more. I couldn't take the overload of information, listen to the screams of former victims of this place. I would rather die. I pulled away from the light of the behemoth, pulling myself towards the dark depths of the ocean. I fought against the urge to turn back, to return to the surface, fighting off the images of monsters in the depths awaiting me. Anything, even the creature from earlier with its ominous smile, was better than another moment in the light of the behemoth. The water began to vibrate, and somehow I heard something. A sound, like a tremendous horn blowing, shaking the very fabric of the universe. I knew it was the colossal monster above. I knew what it wanted. To pull me into its light. I didn't know what would happen if it was successful, but I knew it was likely a fate worse than death. I felt it, pulling at me mentally and physically, trying to tear me back to the surface. My lungs felt as though they were on fire, but I used every bit of strength I had left to drag myself closer and closer to the depths. I could feel the water rising, being pulled into the air by the behemoth, the terror of which made me only swim faster. My vision darkened with every second, as I continued my swim into oblivion. Another rumble through the water. I feel myself beginning to fade, as thoughts and memories of my family began to fill my mind. I was going to die. I had accepted this, but at least it would be on my own terms. I closed my eyes, feeling the last bit of my strength leaving me, as the instinct to take a breath took over. Then I felt it. A pull from beneath. Familiar from before. A strange, inexplicable current like the one that had taken my canoe, pulling me lower. I didn't fight, and the riptide tore me down at incredible speeds, almost giving me whiplash. I was whipped around with blinding force, at the mercy of the strange sentience behind the current. It continued on like that until slowly, the world faded away, and I opened my mouth to take in a breath. The last thing I saw as I was turned around was a light beaming from the surface, staring down at me. Through me. I expected darkness, and instead was greeted by nightmares. Tumultuous dreams of being torn apart by grinning beasts, and taken by ancient gods. I woke up to bright light, and instantly turned to flee, before realizing something that made me cry tears of relief. I was on land. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the sun. To the sun and the blue sky. Our sun. I leapt back, feeling the cold water of the lake on my foot. I crawled away, recoiling as if from a hungry beast, and in a way, I guess it was. I rose to my feet, stumbling at first as I regained balance, before turning and running around the shore, and back to the path. Back to my home. Even as I finish this, I'm at war with myself about posting it. About risking sounding insane. I suppose it doesn't matter if there's any forum that should be receptive to my experience. I imagine it's this one. I don't know what to think about my experience. I'm grateful I survived, though I'm left struggling with traumas I can't possibly bring to a therapist. In the meantime, if there is anything to take from my experience, it's that if there's ever a fog in the air or a strange storm overhead, you should avoid the water. If you don't, you just might find yourself somewhere else.